America in revolt. Inside the fight against the Trump takeover. January 20th passes, and with it America crossed the line. Take back control was the promise of the new administration, and within a few weeks, the shock was experienced in the country. Streets were choked with rallies and counter-rallies. State capitals were frothing, and the federal employees were even breathing of lists and allegiance surveys. By summer, the battle lines were made. What was to happen was not a mere story of one man, but of a pattern, of a machine, of a chain of maneuvers aimed to amass power into the hands of the executive branch, coupled by a wave of outrage extending across the country, aimed to prevent it. At the heart of this whirlwind is Project 2025, a roadmap drafted by conservative policy groups and like-minded allies that comes to the head of 900 pages. It seeks the reconcentration of federal authority, the displacement of much of the civil service with loyalists, and even a radical reconstruction of decades of governance. Critics say it is an affront to democracy. Its proponents say it is a badly needed correction to years of deep state opposition. One of the initial choices was the federal workforce. In the beginning part of the term, sources of legal confrontation included moves to reincorporate an unpopular workforce classification called Schedule F. The change would mean that tens of thousands of career civil servants could be reclassified out of protections and be fireable more easily. Unions wasted no time in legal action, terming it as a purge of nonpartisan expertise. And the mood in the government offices was grim. Career employees who served under multiple administrations were concerned that it would take the pinch stroke to destroy years of institutional memory. This was the reason of the proponents of the takeover: to clear away so-called obstructionists and bring-and-goers. To the critics, it is the breaking up of the federal machine that is holding the country together. A state of emergency was declared by the administration and National Guard troops were used, along with executive orders that critics charged extended home rule authority. To many observers, the federal government was using the Capitol as a laboratory. Should it be able to bend governance in the Capitol, then it could set an example in doing so in other areas as well. Such risky moves marked how far the executive branch was going to go and how tenuous local autonomy under concentrated power was bound to be. These remarks were hue and cry beyond voice or form. There was a wave of protests in various states, initially in response to the immigration sweeps and changes in policing, and these protests later were replaced by movements labeled as No Kings and Good Trouble Lives On. Protesters also marched in solidarity with immigrant families, LGBTQ+ protections, voting rights, and the maintenance of civil service autonomy. A range of appeals have merged into a common narrative. A resistance movement resolute to defend pluralistic democracy against what it perceived to be an authoritarian power grab. Democratic governors and attorneys general drafted lawsuits to halt civil service reclassifications, mass deportation offensives, and federalist usurpations on local control. In Illinois, plans by the police to call on federal troops to establish order in Chicago with or without the knowledge of the head of state were repulsed by leaders who promised to oppose it as a misuse of authority. Meanwhile, Republican governors applauded the shift in the administration and appropriated the language of restoring order and making the pledge to align state resources with federal efforts. What emerged was a quilt work of enforcement and non-enforcement, and the rights of the residents were determined by where they happened to live on either side of a state border. The feeling of uncertainty was also magnified within the federal agencies. Old-line civil servants told of sleepless nights, panic and fears of mass discharges. Brain drain was a possibility. Institutional knowledge relating to responses to disasters, as well as to public health and diplomacy, was at risk. To the bureaucracy of executives, professionals, and support staffs, the loss of jobs was not the only looming threat, but the undoing of systems developed over generations to service the people. The spillovers were not only felt in the offices of the government, but also in the economy. This all happened in August when federal regulators shut down work on a nearly finished offshore wind farm, throwing the investment of a European energy giant into peril and shocking markets. Those who applauded it looked to the move as a good move towards correcting the wrong past energy policies. Those who had opposed them were criticizing it as a political intervention into the industrial planning. One way or another, the message was received by the White House. It was willing to go with a federal lever to redesign entire sectors on the fly, regardless of upheaval. In the capital, law and order was another area of outburst. An executive order in Washington, D.C., to abolish cashless bail caused heated debates. The administration justified it as plain common sense, but legal scholars said it was a step beyond constitutional limits and turned the style followed in decades of local precedent. Immigration was yet another arena of frontality, as people faced escalated enforcement, resulting in abrupt arrests and family separations. Other advocacy organizations claimed that the state was using the system to instill fear, and government officials said that they were destroying criminal networks. In the streets, the policies amounted, in some cases, to heartbreak, legal limbo, and kindling to protests. It was observed that a number of Project 2025 people had been given key jobs, suggesting continuity between the ideas in the plans and real policies. To admirers, this was evidence of firm leadership and dogmatic consistency. In the eyes of its critics, it proved that the transition project was no longer a theory, but the operating manual of the administration. Inevitably, almost every major disagreement made it into the court. They required judges to decide when there were legal grounds to reclassify positions in the civil service, the degree to which the Congress could exercise sovereignty over the District of Columbia, and whether the executive could exceed its authority in transforming policy by evoking threatened budgetary, withholding, and emphysemetic appeals of emergency. Other than the many cases that have already transformed administrative law on other fronts at the Supreme Court, some believe that the Supreme Court will take many steps in deciding the scope of this executive program. In the wake of all this, the resistance still organized. Immigrant rights organizations established hotlines to respond to rights violations. Voting rights organizations held training of voting rights observers, and civil service unions established legal defense funds. Watchdog groups issued plain language explanations to tricky executive orders, and legislatures were considering what became known as guardrail bills, bills that were intended to bolster oversight and transparency. What came out was a scattered but strong movement in America in revolt against what some regard as a hostile takeover of democratic traditions. Point 3 questions will be hovering over the struggle. Will the administration pass and effect its civil service reforms, or will the courts intervene? Are federal authorities going to maintain control over Washington, D.C., or grant local autonomy to it? Will the protests continue to swell as more policies impact their lives in really fundamental ways, such as on energy bills or in schools, or will the campaign dissipate under the pressure? There is an early indication the coalition is expanding rather than narrowing. This is not an entirely new story in America. There were instances when the powers of executives expanded, and people debated on the extent to which the powers of executive should be permitted to expand. This time it seems different, both in speed and scope. On the one hand, there is a philosophy of governance that is created on disruption and loyalty. On the other is a dispersion of a decentralized network of courts, unions, cities, and millions of ordinary people who intend to wage this fight. It is not the question whether or not there is revolt. The more interesting question here is whether indignation can be converted into results, judicial injunctions that stick, electoral victories that switch, and codes that can endure the next crisis. The cameras are rolling, the orders are being signed, the streets alive, and the story of the takeover and the resistance has only just begun.